The atmosphere within the White House on Wednesday, May 28, 2025, was intended to be one of formal transition. The occasion was the swearing-in ceremony for Jeanine Pirro, the former Fox News host, as the new U.S. Attorney for Washington, D.C. This appointment itself followed a period of political maneuvering, with Ms. Pirro stepping in after President Trump's initial nominee, Ed Martin, failed to secure Senate support. Mr. Martin's views concerning the events of January 6, 2021, had proven to be a significant obstacle. The press corps was present, anticipating routine remarks and photo opportunities associated with such an official induction into a key Justice Department role, a role pivotal in the nation's capital. However, the proceedings took a decidedly unexpected turn. During the press briefing segment that accompanied the ceremony, President Donald Trump faced questions that veered sharply away from Ms. Pirro's new position. Instead, the focus shifted to the contentious arena of international trade and tariff policies. It was CNBC White House correspondent Megan Cassella who posed a question that visibly irked the president. She introduced a term that had been circulating within financial circles, a phrase designed to encapsulate a perceived pattern in the president's approach to trade negotiations, particularly his use of tariff threats as a bargaining chip. The question centered on the taco trade, an acronym that reporters and market analysts had begun to employ. The term itself, blunt and somewhat provocative, was clearly not one the president had encountered previously, or at least not one he was prepared to address in such a public forum. His immediate reaction was one of surprise, quickly followed by clear displeasure. The query suggested that market optimism or higher market levels might be attributable to a belief that the president ultimately chickens out of his most aggressive tariff threats, allowing negotiations to continue and averting the most severe economic impacts. This confrontation highlighted the persistent scrutiny of President Trump's economic policies. It also underscored the often unpredictable nature of White House press events, where ceremonial proceedings can abruptly transform into substantive and sometimes heated policy debates. The question about the taco trade served as a stark reminder of how market participants and observers attempt to decipher and anticipate the administration's next moves. The president's response would offer further insight into his own interpretation of his negotiating tactics, setting the stage for a robust defense of his actions on the global economic stage, far from the intended focus of Ms. Pirro's significant day. The term taco trade, which caused such a stir at the White House briefing, stands for Trump always chickens out. This rather pointed phrase was highlighted by this columnist in a Financial Times article published on May 2, 2025. It was developed to describe a recurring pattern observed by some market participants and analysts. The pattern involves President Trump making bold threats to impose significant tariffs on goods from various trading partners. These threats often lead to initial market trepidation, with indices potentially dipping as investors weigh the implications of escalating trade disputes and the potential for economic disruption. The term seeks to capture this dynamic succinctly. The core idea behind the taco trade is that historically, after these initial strong pronouncements and the ensuing market anxiety, the president has often relented. This relenting might take the form of postponing the implementation of tariffs, reducing their proposed scale, or agreeing to further rounds of negotiations. Consequently, markets tend to rebound, sometimes sharply, as the perceived immediate danger of a full-blown trade war subsides. The taco trade therefore suggests a market strategy. One might anticipate initial negative reactions to tariff threats, followed by a recovery when the administration pulls back from the brink, creating opportunities for traders. This label, while informal and somewhat critical, reflects a genuine attempt by financial commentators to make sense of the president's negotiating style. It implies a degree of predictability in what often appears to be an unpredictable policy environment. The argument is that the president uses maximalist demands as an opening gambit, intending to secure concessions, but is ultimately pragmatic enough to avoid the most damaging economic consequences that the full imposition of these threats might entail. The market, according to this theory, has learned to look past the initial rhetoric, anticipating a more moderate outcome after a period of heightened tension and brinkmanship. It is crucial to understand that this term is an interpretation of market behavior and presidential actions, not necessarily an accepted fact within the administration itself. The very notion of chickening out carries a negative connotation, suggesting a lack of resolve which, as became evident, President Trump vehemently rejects. Nevertheless, the taco trade concept had gained enough traction in financial discussions to warrant a direct question at a presidential press conference, demonstrating its currency among those closely watching the intersection of policy and market movements in the current economic climate. President Trump's reaction to being confronted with the taco trade label was immediate and forceful. He stated quite plainly that he had never heard the term before, and characterized the question from CNBC's Megan Cassella as a nasty question. His demeanor shifted from the ceremonial composure fitting Jeanine Pirro's swearing in to one of indignant defense. The president took particular issue with the implication embedded in the acronym, specifically the phrase "chickens out." He questioned this characterization directly, asking rhetorically, "I chicken out? I've never heard that," clearly signaling his strong disagreement with such an assessment of his negotiation tactics. In his response, President Trump offered his own framework for understanding his approach to tariffs, particularly concerning China. He dismissed the idea that he backs down from threats, instead framing his actions as strategic negotiation. He referenced a hypothetical high tariff figure suggesting, "You mean because I reduced tariffs on China from 145% that I said down to 100 and then down to another number?" This was presented not as a retreat, but as a deliberate process of setting a high initial bargaining position and then adjusting it as negotiations progress. He emphasized that his current tariffs on China are set at a significant 30%. The president elaborated on this negotiation philosophy, explaining that starting with a very high number, such as the 145% he mentioned, was a tactic to bring trading partners to the table and extract concessions. He acknowledged that such a figure was exceptionally high, stating, "We were very nice to China, we were basically going cold turkey with China, we were doing no business because of the tariff because it was so high. And I knew that." This, in his view, demonstrated strength and a willingness to take tough measures, rather than a tendency to capitulate. He sees the subsequent reductions as part of a successful negotiation process, not a failure of will. This robust defense underscores a fundamental disconnect between the market's interpretation, as encapsulated by the taco trade term, and the president's own perception of his actions. Where some see a pattern of threats followed by 11th-hour reprieves, President Trump sees a consistent and firm negotiating stance designed to achieve better trade deals for the United States. His explicit rejection of the chickening out narrative highlights his commitment to being seen as a strong negotiator who is not afraid to use tariffs as a powerful tool, even if the initial demands are later modified through dialogue. The discussion surrounding the taco trade also touched upon ongoing trade tensions with other major economic blocs, notably the European Union. Just last week, prior to this press briefing, President Trump had threatened to impose substantial 50% tariffs on a range of goods imported from the EU. These tariffs were initially slated to become effective on June 1, 2025, a rapidly approaching deadline that had caused considerable concern among businesses on both sides of the Atlantic. Such a move would have represented a significant escalation in trade friction with key allies, potentially impacting numerous industries and consumer prices across the board. However, in a move that some observers might connect to the pattern described by the taco trade theory, the administration subsequently announced a postponement of these EU tariffs. The new effective date was pushed back to July 9, 2025. The stated reason for this delay was to allow more time for negotiations between US and EU officials. While the president framed such postponements as good faith efforts to reach amicable agreements, critics and some market analysts might see it as another instance of a tough threat being walked back, at least temporarily, lending some credence to the idea that the initial bark is worse than the eventual bite. The setting for this pointed exchange on international trade policy was, as noted, the swearing-in ceremony for Jeanine Pirro. This made the heated discussion particularly striking. Typically, such events are carefully managed to project an image of unity and purpose. The interjection of a contentious economic debate sparked by a provocative term like taco trade shifted the focus dramatically. It provided an unfiltered glimpse into the president's sensitivity to criticism regarding his negotiating prowess and his eagerness to defend his administration's tariff strategies, regardless of the original agenda for the gathering. Ultimately, the fiery response to the taco trade term reveals the ongoing tension between the president's portrayal of his trade policies as consistently strong and strategically flexible, and the market's attempt to find predictable patterns in his actions. While President Trump insists his approach is one of calculated negotiation from a position of strength, some financial observers continue to anticipate a degree of moderation after initial aggressive postures. The episode, occurring amidst the formality of Ms. Pirro's induction, serves as a potent reminder of how central trade remains to this administration's agenda, and how closely its every move is scrutinized.